Hello folks, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, then hello. The topic of today's video came about as I've recently hit the 3-month anniversary of traveling in my van and living in it full time. And here I am, 5,000 miles later, over 220 hours of actual driving and 12 countries over the last 3 months. I've taken this opportunity to self-reflect on the key challenges and lessons, realizations that I've had over this period through this journey. Now, the timing of this couldn't have been any better as I've literally just arrived in Portugal yesterday. So it marks the end of one chapter, which was the last 3 months of traveling, going through Europe, the freedom that I've experienced over that chapter, and now going into the next chapter, which is slowing down the travels a little bit, still living in a van, but slightly differently, and enjoying and getting to know Portugal. So before I start talking about the challenges and realizations, I want to kind of set the scene, as always, to give you some more information in terms of where I was at when I set on this journey and how that is relevant to the rest of the story. For starters, when I set out on this journey, I've never ever before in my life traveled for longer than 1 month at a time. This 3-month journey has been the longest I've ever been away from home at one time. Also the longest I've been on the road in a place that I don't always necessarily know how to connect to because it's a different culture, different environments. For example, going through the snow, going through the heat, that's totally different, and a lot changes over 3 months if you're traveling this way. Now, the other thing also to mention is that in the past, as I have traveled quite a lot, but for no more than a month at a time, like I said, I've always had a plan that I knew where I would be staying and I would have my accommodation sorted at the very least. Now, I've done backpacking, I've stayed in hostels, I've solo traveled, so none of that was necessarily new to me. But obviously with the van, as much as I did have a guaranteed home, because it is my home, I didn't necessarily have a guaranteed place to stay, and there was always that element of surprise on one side, which is amazing, but also discomfort because you don't have a guaranteed plan. And the third and important part of this as well, which I will probably make a longer video about this at some point down the line, but when I set out on this journey, my van wasn't completely finished. First of all, I decided to go and take the ferry in the morning on, I can't remember which day of the week it was, but basically the whole packing up and finishing things off, etc., took way longer than I expected, and I ended up postponing the leaving day by 1 day, even though I already had my ticket on the ferry. Even with all the help I've had from my parents helping me finish things off, pack up, all this kind of stuff, I just underestimated how much I needed to get done. Long story short, I didn't have the water connected yet, so I had no running water. I have never filled up my water tank before. I didn't check for any leaks, and although I have fitted my gas tank underneath the van already, I haven't actually tested or filled it up yet. I haven't connected the water heater to it yet, and I haven't tested whether the cooker works. And the reason why I ended up postponing the leaving day by 1 day is, one, I wasn't ready. I ended up packing up until 4 AM with the help of my mum, which I'm extremely grateful for, but also I wanted to ensure that I spent at least the last day in a nice way with my parents to say our goodbyes, and I didn't want to have it to be rushed. And also I wouldn't really get to sleep much, and I wanted to make sure I hit the road in the right mood and at least feeling like I am rested. Alright, so with the ground laid out, I'll go on to the challenges and realizations and lessons. So the number one thing goes all the way back to the first day of arrival. My friends and I planned to meet in Luxembourg on the first day of my arrival, and that is where I was heading towards. And as I was driving, it was quite a drive from France, I had some time to process some feelings and sit with that, but I still didn't necessarily process all of it, and obviously given that I was driving, it didn't give me that specific opportunity to be with it in that moment. As I arrived and we had a nice celebration of me arriving and reconnecting again, this sort of stuff, and I was tired, I went to bed. Again, didn't have much of an opportunity to process these things. But the very next day, I felt strange. I felt confused. This dream that I've been building over the last 18 months has finally come to fruition. And what next? I wasn't sure. I had a lot of stuff going on in my mind in terms of how am I going to make this work with my business? How am I going to, in general, be living this life? I had no idea about doing the water runs. I had no idea about doing the shopping runs, about filling up the gas tank. It was all very, very confusing. Yes, on one side, that dream has finally arrived. On the other, the reality of it was somewhat confusing and new. It took me some time to adjust, but after a couple of days, I started to really fall into place. Yeah, find my 2 feet. And the big lesson from that is, even if you know that the change you're making is going to be better for you and it is the change you want, it isn't necessarily always gonna click and work. Sometimes it might take some adjustment period, because at the end of the day, especially if you're gonna have a big change in your overall lifestyle, it's a new thing and you're going to have to adjust to it. That's okay. You have to give yourself that space and time to sit with those feelings of strangeness. Just let it be, let it happen. Now, the next thing is something I still actually struggle with a little bit. That is to drown the outside noise as the noise is coming from the trees right now. And what I mean by that is fearing judgment from others, especially when you're living in this sort of van life, traveling around. There is always, at least in my head, that voice that says, what if you're not allowed to stay here? What if someone's gonna come and tell you off? What if the police comes and tells you off? What if, what if, what if? It is something that I keep struggling with, and I don't know if I'll ever get over that. Perhaps that is who I am living this lifestyle. I have no idea, we'll see in time. But it has definitely improved, especially the very first day I had to do it alone to find parking after my friends and I separated for a bit. It was strange, it was very difficult to get over that. It's a cliche at the end of the day. It doesn't matter what other people think about you, but it is easier said than done. And in a way it does matter, because it gives you that position to have respect towards others as well. The big lesson from this is that at the end of the day, you are doing something extraordinary by living in a van, by traveling around. You have to have your own morals, and if you ask yourself, is what you're doing currently, perhaps parked in a specific space, is this doing harm to others? Is it doing harm to the nature? And if the answer is no, then, you know, take that risk. The very worst thing that will really happen is that you get told off. And if you're a good person with good communication skills, you'll be able to talk your way out of it. Potentially just showing them a new perspective on things, and actually that not all people living in vans are assholes. The next thing is not necessarily a new realization or lesson, it's more so a reconnection to what I already knew, and that is how important time with myself is. And that especially came about as I was separating from my friends for a little bit, and it really was initially quite hard to do that. It was obviously a change in our routines, a change in that element of safety and comfort, but at the same time it was one of the most important parts of this journey over the last 3 months, because I realized once again how important it is for me to connect to myself, to know my morals, to know my values, to know what I want out of life. And ultimately it is something that helped me to think about where I want this van travel to go, because I had the plan of going to Turkey, but obviously deep within there was that yearning for Portugal, and a few other things came about from that as well. A big important decision was to be okay with that and to reconnect to myself, and how important it is to allow yourself time by yourself, to be comfortable with yourself. By giving myself alone time at least once in a while, it allows me to work through my own shadows, my own demons, to not allow that to project onto others when I spend time with other people. And it's difficult to do that when you're with other people, because one, a lot of your focus will go into spending that time with people, and sometimes these things just creep in. You end up projecting them onto those people in these situations. But by having that alone time, it allows you to actually work on those things, because you're by yourself, especially if you're in nature and you don't have distractions around you. It really allows you that time, because things come up, things that start to feel uncomfortable within you. For example, fear of judgment from others. A lot of that is something that we need to work on, and sometimes something that ends up hurting others if we don't work on it. The next realization is that van life isn't all glamorous. It is the expectation versus reality moment. You see a lot of these things on Instagram making this van life is so amazing and everyone's having all fun all the time, and yeah, whatever. The reality is it's not always going to be fun, and there are things that aren't great in van life and are difficult to do, more difficult than they are in your quote-unquote normal day-to-day life. Exercise is one of those things, for example. Of course, you've got nature, you can do exercise outside, but if it rains, what then? Another thing is you're in a much more confined space. Your body, your mind is going to feel that at some points. Again, you can do things to tackle that. You can spend more time outside, go on walks, hikes, runs, go to cafes, bars, meet people, whatever, right? But it is the truth. It can be quite challenging. Another thing is, especially if you are constantly traveling, and if you are by yourself like me, then it can get quite lonely. And because you're traveling constantly, going from place to place to place to place, it's difficult to actually connect with a place and see it as even a temporary home. Also, to meet new people, it can be quite difficult to do that as well, especially if you're spending time in nature a lot. Another reality check, more relevant if, like me, you are intending to be working from your van or you have a business, is that it is not that easy. It's definitely not as easy as having a permanent place like let's say a hotel or a even short-term rental. Unless you know you can stay in that specific place that you've parked up at and there will be no problems for a longer period of time, then that's okay. But it can be quite difficult if at the back of your mind you always got the idea of, maybe I won't have internet connection here and I've got calls potentially. What if you want to be traveling because you need to get to a certain place by a certain time, and you need to balance that distance of how much you have to travel with the amount of work you might have to do? That's another thing you have to consider. If you're in one place and you don't have to travel around much, then it's definitely a lot easier. There are some things you can definitely do to make it easier, and that is to look at local SIM cards. And also Starlink is another thing. I have one and it's amazing. But obviously, if you're in areas where you might want to be as stealthy as possible, you don't necessarily want a satellite internet dish outside to make it look even more conspicuous. It is a different reality and it is beautiful, don't get me wrong, I love it and I don't want to be negative about it, but don't expect it to all be sunshine and rainbows, because it isn't going to be. There are drawbacks. Now, the next thing I've kind of touched upon already, and that is community and loneliness. And this is especially relevant if you're going to be traveling by yourself, you don't have a partner, and if you're not traveling with friends. I was quite lucky that for a big portion of my travels I was with my friends. I haven't experienced loneliness to the full extent that you could if you are just traveling by yourself constantly. If you are living this van life, and especially staying in nature, and especially traveling around as opposed to staying in one place, and it can become quite difficult to connect with culture, with community, and depends on where you go. It can be difficult depending on which countries you go to connect. You know, if you're passing through towns and you're maybe staying at places for a day, 2, 3 max, it's difficult to really connect with the locals. The next thing is, you don't need a lot in life to be happy and fulfilled. In general, I've been pretty minimalist for a big portion of my life, so it's not necessarily something new to me, but you really start to realize when you're living this lifestyle that a lot of things in life that make you happy and fulfilled are actually free. For me, that has definitely been seeing new places in this world, also doing things like snorkeling, doing activities, enjoying the sun. And I know you can argue that that's not necessarily free, because I had to spend quite a bit of money on the van, for which I am extremely grateful that I was able to do. I was able to save money and work on my business over the last few years and be able to put time and effort into this. It didn't come free, obviously. So I am extremely grateful for that, and I appreciate that that is costly. On the other hand, to upkeep this life on a day-to-day basis, it is quite inexpensive in comparison to living a traditional lifestyle. Also, a lot of the things are accessible for free. I've camped for free everywhere I've been to so far, with the exception of a couple of places in Albania, because it's quite difficult there, and that was actually staying at a restaurant and having food, and then having a place to stay. So not necessarily a typical camping place. A lot of it is free and you don't need a lot. I've gotten rid of a lot of things before coming out on this journey, things that I had because of sentimental value or whatever, and I realized I actually don't need them. They don't necessarily make me happy. And look at all this beauty that's around when you're traveling, and you can have all that for free. The last big realization is in terms of where I see my future and what I would be doing and where I would be doing it. Like I said, a lot of that came from being able to sit with myself and to self-reflect on things. That realization is that I wanted to head to Portugal, towards Portugal. That is a dream that I've had for a long time now, and I've decided that there's no point in waiting for that to happen. I need to go for it now. That is in terms of the place I see myself in, and we'll see where that heads into the next 3, 4, 6, 10, 12 months and so on. But another thing is how much love I have for making music. Now, for those that don't know me, as a kid, I've always been making sounds, singing, and driving my parents crazy for a lot of that time. And I always wanted to do music, but I always shied away from it. I don't know, I felt like I wasn't good enough. I was fearing the judgment. But now I know that music is something that I'm going to be pursuing. And a lot of the time I had in this nature, I felt really big inspiration from being in that nature, sitting under the stars, sitting under the sun, by the sea, by the coast, to write my own songs. And I've got a lot of my own lyrics. I've been playing guitar a lot, and I want to get into electronic music as well. And that is a big realization for me, because that changes the way I want to live my life and what I want to do in my life. And you'll definitely be seeing all these things right away, upcoming in the next few months. But for the time being, that's it for this video, and I hope that you enjoyed the topic of this video. I hope you enjoyed the video itself, and if you have, I would appreciate a like, of course, as always. If you're enjoying these videos so far, if you could subscribe to my channel, it would mean a lot to me. Other than that, I will see you in the next video. Peace and love.